All right, let's get started. As I mentioned earlier, I'm John Gamble, Director of Product Marketing here at Corelight. I'll be emceeing today's webcast, and we've got two great esteemed panelists with a bunch of knowledge to share with you today. So I'd encourage you to ask questions throughout. You can use your chat panel under the questions tab to submit a question and we'll see it. If it makes sense to answer in the moment, we will. Otherwise, we'll save questions till the end. So with that, let's get started. Today's webcast is how to threat hunt for C2 traffic, regardless of protocol or port. Presented by speakers from Corelight and Active Countermeasures. We will look first at how adversaries operate using C2 communications and some of the nuances behind that and the problems we're trying to address. Then we'll dive into some of the network visibility and analysis requirements that you need to take to this problem to effectively find these C2s in your environment. And lastly, we'll spend the bulk of today's presentation in agenda item number 4, where we'll walk through very detailed methods for C2 hunting and actually show some practical examples with real data presented to show you how you would go about finding these C2s in your own environment. And lastly, we'll save five or so minutes at the end for Q&A. If we're not able to get to your questions today, we will follow up with you via email afterwards. And lastly, a recording of today's broadcast will be made available. So if you're not able to attend today's presentation in its entirety, or you'd like to share it with a colleague afterwards, a recording will be made available and sent to you via email. So with that, let's meet today's panelists. Chris, maybe you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a security geek, been at this for years, and I am so damn lucky that I get paid to do what my OCD would force me to do anyway.
And Alex, yourself?
Hey, I am an open source security guy. I came from the Snort world and am enjoying network security monitoring with Zeek and Corelight. Looking forward to talking about malware and all the crazy things those guys do in the wild today.
Awesome. Now, Chris, I'm going to hand it over to you for screen control for this next section. So give me one moment here. Go ahead, Chris. You should have screen control.
It's not letting me change slides.
There we go. I see my mouse moving. You're good.
Hey, I'm in control. We're all in trouble. So I wanted to start off with just a quick sanity check. Like, how do the bad guys get in the first place? I mean, we're all running antivirus these days. Everything's supposed to be protected. How do they get in the first place? The number one method of making it into your network is phishing. There's two possibilities. One is generic phishing. Hey, I'm in Nigeria and have money I want to send you, and I'm going to spray that out to a bunch of different people. The big one is spear phishing. We've been seeing that taking over city after city after city, where they'll go in, they'll do their research and find out what construction projects are going on. That's public information. Public information is also what construction companies have got those contracts. They then pretend to be that construction company and say, hey, so I know you usually send us a check, but wire the money this way this month, or something along those lines. A lot of folks fall for those tactics. If there's one thing you really need to be doing in your own environment is phishing your employees at least every other month. This is where we tend to kind of fall down. But this is what allows the malware to get in the first place. Once it's in, so I've got malware on your internal network. I need to get out somehow. So I need to find a way out through your firewall. I'm typically going to go with one of the protocols that are normally supported, like DNS or HTTPS. We'll talk more about that later. But the point is, I can't connect to it directly. So what I end up with is an intermediary server, command and control server, sometimes referred to as C2. So the system checks in with that server, says, hey, do you have anything for me to do? If there's something waiting in its queue, it executes on those commands. If it doesn't, it just goes back into sleep mode. So now all I need to do is connect to the server, issue some sort of commands, and then my bot army will go off and do whatever it is I wanted it to do. If you think about this, it's think of it, a good analogy of this is email. If I need to send you a message, hey, grab all your local spreadsheets and send them to me. I don't know where you are. I don't know if you got a firewall in the way, But with email, what's kind of cool is I can send it to a server, you retrieve it from that server, and then you could do whatever it is I want to do. So email is a really good analogy. And oh, by the way, email is also a really good C2 channel. We've seen Gmail and a few others being used for that type of thing. So we'll get into that a little bit deeper as we go through. And Alex, this one's you.
Yeah, so, speaking of different ways that data can come in and out of your network, Chris mentioned DNS earlier, and it's very apropos because it's one of the most popular ways to move, either the actual command and control portion of sending things to execute and getting results back, but also moving data through the network. Because DNS is one of those services that's available on every network. It's got a number of different ways that you could send data, either by odd subdomains or by text records or CNAMEs or even pointers if you want to get obscure. But it's versatile enough, it's small enough, and the payload is typically not monitored enough that, we see it as a very common theme in the wild for attackers doing that outreach to the infected hosts in the network. Next slide, please, Chris.
Yeah, and here's a great example of that. So as Alex was saying, DNS, very popular channel. This is a capture of DNS Cat2, or at least a variation thereof. And what you can see here is I'm going from an upper port number. I'm going to port 53. 53 is the well-known port for DNS. So from a firewall level anyway, it looks like it's just normal DNS traffic. This is a CNAME query. Hey, that's normal, right? Down here, we got a text query. They're both doing the same type of thing. This is actually a command and control channel. If you take a look at what the CNAME here, it's a very long string of characters that's within the domain honestimnotevil.com. So skip the domain. That one's kind of obvious, right? We could pattern match on evil and find stuff like this all the time. Unfortunately, attackers aren't that easy on us. But you can see it's, as a human, you can look at this and say, no, that's not a valid host name, right? Because no one would ever name their server 3BB403, blah, blah, blah. So as a human, it's easy to kind of pattern match on this. From a, I want to script something to catch it, it's actually a whole lot harder. Now, this is a fairly long string. Maybe you can go look for that, but they could make it shorter to get around that. The other one that kind of stood out to me here is if you look at the text record query at the bottom, we have one query, we have no name server records returned, we have no additional records returned. Well, that's not normal. Normally, anytime I do a query, that information comes back just in case I might need it later. These are all set to 0. That's kind of odd. So that might be something I can pattern match on. But then again, anybody listening to this who's writing this type of code can easily make sure, oh, okay, we'll just populate those fields. And now that would be something you couldn't match on anymore. So to try and hit this from a signature perspective, really hard because they can do a very good job of making it look like normal traffic.
Well, and going forward for just a second on the slides, since we went backwards there.
Oh. Wow, the up and down arrows do different things. That's cool.
21st century, and AV is always fun. Yeah, perfect.
There we go.
Hang on there for a second. You want to talk about the difficulty of signatures to detect things. Attackers have a million different ways of transferring data. One of those vectors that a lot of people wouldn't think about necessarily is Twitter, where you can literally just post messages as a given account that are monitored by remote systems, do direct messages back and forth. Nobody's ever going to be able to blacklist that as a domain or even as an AS or other portion of the network. And most tools are not going to be able to get all the way into parsing a Twitter message to be able to see, that it actually has a payload that doesn't look anything like a human tweeting or sending a message. So there's a lot of different ways that attackers can go about obfuscating their intentions and making it difficult for simple kind of pattern matching techniques to take on from a signature perspective. And if we go to the next slide, the question that pops up a lot of the time is encryption. Hey, everybody is smart enough to be able to use SSL these days. It's becoming a larger and larger percentage of the internet. What are you going to be able to do about scenarios like that? And that's really where some of the level of depth that Zeek as a protocol parser and RITA as an analytics engine can bring to the table to really go for more fundamental, protocol layer things that stand out as patterns in C2 versus normal human-initiated traffic, and can bring to the attention of an analyst who can then bring that human intelligence to bear to confirm an alert and be able to do useful incident response, even when a payload is obfuscated or data is otherwise hidden.
Thanks, Alex. So this next section, we're going to look at kind of what are the baseline requirements you're going to need to be able to see into your network traffic to catch and identify these types of C2 paths.
And so this image is a representation of the average SIM visibility process in large enterprises that we see in the field today. There's a whole bunch of different log sources that are all in slightly different format with potentially just a touch skewed timestamps and all the other complexities that come in bringing disparate data sources together. And fundamentally, once you get beyond a challenge like that, if we go to the next slide, we'll see that the data sources themselves can even be problematic. On the side of, like, for example, if you're pulling DNS records out of your Active Directory that's serving it up, you're not going to have quite the information you need because you'll see the query records that come in, but not the answers that come back out. If you're looking at a NetFlow level record, it's wonderful to see that these IPs talked on these ports for that many bytes, but not having any idea of what the data that was exchanged is going to present you with an obvious roadblock as you're trying to dig in and find out if this is legitimate traffic or not. And at the far side of the spectrum, of course, is folks who are doing full packet capture on the basis that, well, now I have everything, I'll be able to get anything I need out of an incident response. Those guys often find that they've just simply got too much data on their hands. Trying to find a needle in a haystack is always a difficult process, but it becomes even more complicated when you run into things like packet captures larger than 500 megabytes crashing your Wireshark all day long, or the fact that you've only got 2 weeks worth of visibility because it took you an entire rack full of disks to hold even that much data, but this incident came in 30 days before. So you're left with gaps in the visibility even when you have what's supposed to be an unlimited visibility solution. And so we move forward here.
Yeah, Chris, if you can talk to us about kind of some of the limitations of popular analysis approaches for catching C2s.
Yeah, happy to. So one of the big ones I see people getting drawn to is threat intel, and it's I can see the draw. Hey, they can give me domain names, they can give me IP addresses that tell me what to go and block. The problem is attackers have evolved. If you think about antivirus, go back to like 1990. I know most of us probably weren't even born then, but if you go back to like 1990, AV was awesome because I could get signatures faster than someone would, perhaps send me a floppy disk that was infected with something. So it was a great way to go about protecting myself. And then what we noticed, circa late 90s, early 2000s, was that malware started coming out much, much faster, like, sometimes as often as 5,000 variants per minute. Trying to blacklist that stuff just didn't work, which is why a lot of us have gone like the carbon black route. We're using whitelisting now, and it works a whole lot better. Threat intel feeds are kind of the same thing. If you go through and you look at what's on the list, a lot of times it's dynamic addresses. So it's things like cloud environments or shared web platforms. It's stuff that it's really easy for the attacker to go through, launch an attack, and pivot and be someplace else less than 20 minutes later. Well, if I'm taking data from a threat intel feed that's 24 hours old, let alone 3 months old, that data is no good to me now anymore. And I'm going to see matches, right? I'll see times that, oh, hey, my threat intel feed caught something and we blocked it. Hey, it worked. Well, but did it? Was that actually the attacker, or was that some normal traffic pattern? You don't know. So threat intel feeds, a lot of holes there. Heuristics, same type of thing. I've been kind of talking through, hey, you could try and pattern match on this, but here's how easily the attacker could get around it. So yeah, there's definitely some issues there. The other thing I wanted to do, just kind of a sanity check for this talk. So a little bit later, we're going to get into using Zeek to go through and try and identify command and control channels. Awesome. What I wanted to do was kind of look at that. Hey, well, what if I just used a pattern matching heuristic-based IDS to go through and look at that same data set? Would that pull out the same type of thing? So I grabbed Suricata, I grabbed the emerging threats rule set, which is the one everybody uses, grabbed this data set, ran it through, and here's what it found. So it found I've got internal systems that have new hardware installed, because Windows is going out and saying, hey, there's a new hardware device installed. I need to go out and find a new driver. So I see a couple of instances of that here. And it's also flagging this data set because it's saying, hey, people are going to .cc, and that might be obfuscating the fact that it's not .com or .co. They might be getting fooled to go to some site that they don't expect to. So as we go through and do and oh, by the way, this data set has Empire and it has DNS C2, and it didn't catch either one of those. So as we go through the Zeek stuff and we kind of talk about the process to go through and do a threat hunt, why do we need that process? This is why, because when you try and go through and do it at a signature level, you're going to miss a ton of stuff.
Great, thank you, Chris. Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you and give you screen control here so you can click through these next few slides.
All right.
You should be in control.
All right. So the way that Zeek approaches the problem of data is to try to be in between NetFlow or IT-based logs and packet capture by coming in all the way through layer 7 and producing all of the metadata that you're going to need from an incident response perspective, pulling out user agents and URIs and all the other pieces of data that you need on all the most common application protocols that are on the network. Being able to pull out files at speed. We've got folks doing 15,000 a minute in the wild and feeding those into sandboxes or DLP or whatever other analytics tools you might have on site, as well as being able to produce alerts based upon different packages that are analyzing the network traffic as it goes along and looking for behavioral indicators. But doing all of this at a size that is approximately 1% packet capture, so allowing you to retain that data for a much longer period of time than you would with a full packet capture solution. And to give you an idea of the kind of data that is contained within these logs, we walk through a classic scenario, as Chris described earlier, of how do the bad guys get in. So it starts off with that email phishing attack, and then somebody actually goes ahead and clicks the link, and at that point they get off to a website that the attacker controls. That is then going to download some kind of a file that loads malware onto the machine, which then reaches out to get second stage loader, do its beaconing thing, talk to its command and control over DNS, and you can see that really every part of that kill chain is contained within the metadata logs that are being extracted from your network stream. So everything that you need to follow the trail and understand how an attack played out and what all the parts of its infrastructure are contained within one comprehensive, normalized set of logs that contain an indexing layer we refer to as the UID that allows you to pivot in between layer 4, layer 7, files being set down, etc. So a very simple, easy way to understand what has happened with the network traffic, even if that traffic is encrypted. Again, we talked about attackers are using more and more encryption in the wild, and that's why we do a very in-depth job of parsing everything that happens SSL-wise, certificate layer. We're able to come in and give you things like, well, this is a self-signed certificate, or it's expired, or it just has a organization name of Internet Widget PTY, which is the default out of the X509 command line tools, and is an easy way to cherry pick a bad guy who doesn't quite know what he's doing. And give you the level of visibility at that DNS layer that we talked about being so prevalent earlier, so that you can see information about the query, the response, what type of record it was, all of those little details that Chris was pointing out earlier as subtle ways to detect a malicious tunnel as opposed to regular DNS is going to be there in the data that's extracted. And even going outside of common protocols like DNS and HTTP for a moment, one of the most important things that Zeek does is dynamic protocol detection, where it's looking at the layer 7 payload and attempting to match a known protocol to determine what is happening on a given port, as opposed to just saying, hey, this is 80 and so it's HTTP. That's able to do things like find these protocols on off ports that a firewall or an IDS might miss, as well as be able to see things like, well, this is going out over port 80, but it's binary data. It's clearly not HTTP, it's just abusing the firewall loophole to go outbound on port 80, which is a technique that actually would have picked off 1% of all the samples I ever sandboxed back at SourceFire. So is very powerful as an anomaly detection piece to find some of these more advanced attackers who really know how to get around a lot of the basic network defenses that are going to make your job difficult from a signature perspective. And so just from a brief architectural perspective of, how does this all work? We sit out of band. You need to feed us packets, typically by way of a packet broker like a Gigamon or an Ixia, or et cetera. We'll take a span or a tap off your route switch infrastructure if that's easier. We talk to the cloud as well, but basically process all of that data and then feed it out into the SIM of your choice, with the idea being that, pretty much everybody on this call has too many consoles that they log into already today. We want to enrich other tools and processes and make your life easier in those other consoles. And so, we feed into your existing stack as opposed to being another piece to add on top of it. So, that said, that's probably enough pitch about what Zeek is and what it does. I will note briefly for anybody who's interested, our open source user conference is going to be coming up next month in Seattle. You can get more details at zeekweek.com. But from there, I'm going to yield the floor over to Chris for some of the details about what RITA can bring to the table in terms of analytics.
Great, thanks, Alex. Chris, I'm going to give you back control here. Let's see.
You sure you trust me to actually figure out how to change the slides, right?
You should have screen control.
I do not. Your mouse pointer is not following me.
How about now? There we go.
Hey, there we go. Come on. There we go. Wow, simple things are always hard. So where do you start? So we want to talk about threat hunting. Internal system gets compromised, starts calling out to a command and control server. You can't do it signature-based, unless you want to only find the old stuff. So where do you even begin? The best place to start, at least from my opinion, is to start with persistent connections. Look for internal systems that are carrying on regular conversations with systems out on the internet. So I don't mean, someone goes and checks Google every now and then. When you look at what's out there in the wild, they tend to be very programmatic, meaning they'll connect once per second, they'll connect once per minute. They may introduce some jitter. meaning that it might say connect once per minute plus or minus 50%, which means it might connect at a 30-second interval sometimes, a 90-second interval sometimes, but it's still going to average out to about that 60-second interval. But in either event, it's connecting out on a regular basis all day long, or it's just holding open the connection all the time. So those are just two quick examples, and I'll get into a little bit more detail in a moment of how your systems could be connecting out to these things. That's what to go look for first, because there's a ton of things we can go in and look for, right? We could go in and say, hey, is the user agent unique within the internal environment? Well, you can do that, but do you really care, right? In other words, if I've got a system with a unique user agent, yeah, that could be an indication that it's something unique to my environment that, I don't expect to be there, but oh, come on, we all have unique stuff on our environment, right? There's always a bunch of one-offs kicking it around someplace. Do we really want to be tracking all of those down? Well, if those things are not calling out on a regular basis to some IP address out on the internet I don't recognize, it's probably not worth our time. Same thing, self-signed digital certificates, right? We don't want to overly trust them, of course, but we do run into situations where, yeah, we're using a self-signed cert. We're logging into an interface that's only used by internal people. We manage the server. We're going to live with a self-signed cert. So just because it's self-signed doesn't necessarily mean it's evil. Now, if I can tag a persistent connection, and now I start to see, oh, hey, the user agent's unique. It's talking to a self-signed digital certificate, or like what Alex was getting into. I'm seeing HTTP traffic, not SSL traffic going over TCP 443. We've seen that one before. Those are good clues about what type of C2 I might be dealing with. So once I identify the persistent connection, now I can start pulling in these other things to see how suspicious is it, how much should I be freaking out in order to be able to kind of run down what's going on within our environment. Excuse me. So the goal is to identify persistent connections. Identify, hey, I've got an internal system. It's talking to somebody out on the internet, and it's doing it on a regular basis. It's taking place not just during work hours, it's happening all the time, or it might even look like it has business hours, but it's calling off every half hour. There's some sort of pattern, if you will, to the communications between that internal system and that system out on the internet. Now, once we start digging into this, let's say we find a persistent connection. One of the first things we'll want to figure out is there a valid business need for this? Meaning that just because the persistent connection is taking place doesn't necessarily mean it's evil. And I can give you a great example. Excuse me. Network time protocol, right? Most of our systems run NTP. NTP will go out and check its time every 50 minutes to 30 minutes, depending upon what operating system you're running. And it asks the exact same size question and gets back the exact same size answer each time. So it's going off on a regular time basis. The same amount of data is moving every time. That's kind of like the epitome of a persistent beacon that's taking place. But if it's going to an NTP server that I expect to be using, that's something I'm going to want to go through and whitelist off so that I'm not looking at that every time I go through and do a threat hunt. So where to start? So we've already kind of covered, you don't really want to start with like signature based because you're going to miss anything new. The threat intel feeds, those are always going to be behind the times as well. So you need to go in and go through the data and look at it yourself. I know this is kind of tough for a lot of us where, excuse me, we're kind of time constrained in what we have going on a daily basis. So maybe this is something we do on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis. We can go through and kind of figure out what time interval kind of works best. But one of the key things to go with here is a large amount of data. Meaning, don't go away and create a 5-minute packet capture. Take a look through that and say, hey, all clear, ready to go. Remember, one of the things I'm talking about here is if I have a system calling out once per hour on the hour all day long every day, that's a persistent connection. If I can't explain a business need for that, that's something I really need to be concerned about. Well, if it's happening once per hour, if I only capture an hour's worth of data, I'm never going to see it. It's not going to stand out for me. If I have 12 hours, well, now I've got 12 data points to work with. If I have 24 hours, well, now I have 24 data points to work with. One of the awesome things about Zeek is it takes all the stuff you really care about and saves it, and then ignores everything else. So one of the things we found is that from like a packet capture perspective, You know, if you look at like how much storage is used on a packet capture versus how much is stored with Zeek to get the information you really need to run down C2, you know, Zeek's maybe about 5% of that storage level, maybe a little bit less if you compress it too. So to go through and save a couple of days to be able to review all at the same time, real easy to do if you're working with Zeek. And you want to analyze these in pairs, meaning that I want to go through and look at, okay, for my internal IP address, who's everybody you talk to out on the internet? How much of that looks like it has a repeating pattern to it? You know, if there's one connection, great, I need to run that one down a little bit further. If none of them look that way, okay, fine, I don't need to go through and deal with that. But you want to do it on an IP to IP level. It's helpful if you can do it to go through on an internal system to a fully qualified domain name level, because sometimes what you deal with is domain name fronting. In other words, we all have found that putting a CDN in front of our website really helps with performance. Well, bad guys have figured out, hey, if I put a CDN in front of my C2 server, it helps with performance, and it helps to obfuscate what we're actually looking for here. One of the nice things about Zeek is that if you go through the DNS log, it will tell you, hey, somebody did this lookup and got back this IP address. That is awesome information, because now when I'm looking at who's talking to what on the internet, normally my only resource would be a PTR record lookup, right? I'd go out and do a lookup and say, oh, okay, this system talked to 3 IP addresses within Amazon. Yeah, okay, whatever. Well, if you go through the Zeek logs though, and you go through the DNS logs, you'll see, oh, wait a minute, every time they were trying to get to c2.evil.com when they went to those 3 Amazon addresses, well, now that tells you, oh, wait, okay, C2 traffic, it's domain name fronting, and I need to combine the traffic going to those three together in order to see, is there any beacon-like behavior taking place? So again, you know, there's a lot of data to sift through here, but there's some tools we'll kind of talk you through to kind of make life a little bit easier. So it can be a beacon-based connection like I'm talking about, or it can just be a simple long connection, meaning they connect out, they just hold the connection open all the time. There's a derivative of the two, meaning that one of the things we're just starting to see attackers doing now is it beacons, but it only beacons like once per hour. So if you look at a day's worth of data, there's only 24 data points to work with. But every time it beacons, it holds the connection open for an hour. Well, now from a long connections perspective, it's only holding the connection open for an hour. You probably have stuff on your network that's in like, you know, the 4-hour plus range, so that may not even blip on the radar. And if you're looking for, you know, who's communicating very frequently out on the internet to go look for beacons, 24 is going to kind of fall off that list. So you need a way to go through and kind of look at it from a cumulative perspective, meaning that if I connect out 24 times for an hour each time, you need a way to be able to identify, hey, that's a 24-hour connection. You know, that connection was being in place for 24 hours. So what's a beacon look like? If you take a look at this graph along the bottom, my x-axis is time. So every one of those bars is an hour period of time. My y-axis is quantity. This is how many times this IP address was seen sending traffic to that IP address, or doing session establishment to that IP address. So I'm seeing how many times per hour are they talking to each other. See this little red line here? This kind of identifies the epitome of a beacon. Anytime I can look at a long period of time and see the same number of connections going out each hour, that tells me, yeah, this is a beacon that's taking place here. Even if they have jitter, you know, like I said, if I go in and I say beacon once per minute plus or minus 50%, well, now I could beacon at a 30-second interval, it could be a 90 or anywhere in between. What you find is that if you average that stuff out over time, like look at it in 1-hour chunks like we are here, or at 2-hour chunks even better, that normalizes out, meaning about as often as it'll beacon at a 30-second interval, it'll beacon at a 90-second interval, which averages out to 60, and hey, you still end up with this flat line. This chart here is just showing the session gap time, meaning that all of what this tells me, one solid line here tells me all of these sessions are taking place at the exact same time interval between each other. Again, this is kind of the epitome of a beacon. Now we're talking about timing. You also want to make sure you take a look at these things from a session size perspective, meaning that if I see a bunch of connections going out from my internal system to a host on the internet, one of the quick, dirty ways to kind of figure out, is this C2 or is this something else, is to analyze the size of every one of those sessions. Here's an example of that in analysis. So my y-axis is quantity. This is how many connections took place between two IP addresses that we don't see in the small screen cap. My x-axis is the amount of data transferred in the session. So notice a majority of my connections transmitted somewhere around, I'm going to call that 90 bytes worth of data. And if this is C2, that's a heartbeat. Meaning, remember we talked about a compromised system is going to call home and say, hey, do you have anything for me to do? And a majority of the time it's going to get back, no, go back to sleep. That's what takes place over most of those beacon sessions. This is my heartbeat. Now notice out here, we've got another data point around the 300 byte range. What's this? This is one time it called home and was told, yes, I have something for you to do. Now, as Alex was talking about, a lot of this stuff gets encrypted. And if it doesn't get encrypted, it's at least obfuscated. So even if we had the payloads in front of us, we may not know what that command set was. But the amount of data here gives us some really good clues, right? It's 90 bytes just to do a heartbeat, 300 bytes were transferred. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess the attacker said, show me what processes are running in memory right now. Or maybe they said, show me a directory listing off of the local drive. It was some minimal amount of probing that was taking place. In other words, we haven't yet gotten into, hey, install these 2 or 3 other rootkits on the box so it's that much harder to recover the system, nor has it gotten into grab all the Excel spreadsheets off of that system and pull them down to the local system, pull them up to the C2 server. That hasn't started taking place yet. So what I love about session size analysis is A, it can help you ID a beacon. B, it can identify a beacon when no other method will, and I'll circle back to that one in just a second. But C, it identifies when the backdoor has actually been activated, and from a forensic standpoint, we really need this. Now, I said there's some things you can do with session analysis that you can't do any other way. What was I talking about? Alex was digging into this a little bit earlier when he was talking about using social media for a C2 channel. He was talking about, hey, if somebody's sending messages out to Twitter, you don't know if it's a user, you don't know if it's C2. And that's true. But sometimes you get lucky, meaning that an attacker, when they're using C2, or when they're using C2 through social media, they may use the same command set every time and not try to obfuscate the size. A great example of that, GCAT. So GCAT, or a variation thereof, was what was used to bring down the Ukrainian power grid by what we think was maybe the Russians. And what that did is that used a Gmail account as the C2 server. So the remote access Trojan went in, installed basically a Gmail client, and started checking a Gmail account to see, do you have anything for me to do? No, go back to sleep. And if you look at the data that was collected, there are periods of time where you can see, long periods of time where you can see no command sets were going by besides checking mail. Well, from an email perspective, that's odd, right? Because if you look at the stats, we all receive about 113 messages per day. Whether we intend to or not, we're part of groups and everything else. So an email account that's checking all the time for like 24 hours or more and never gets anything, that's either A, the most sorry person we've ever met, right? Because they constantly want somebody to communicate with them and nobody ever does, or it's command and control. And it usually ends up being command and control. Session size analysis, that's the only way to tag it. So let's start easy. Let's start with long connections. So Zeek has this awesome thing called the conn.log. And the conn.log goes through and just gives you some great stats on every single connection that it saw go by. One of the things you can very quickly and easily do is leverage that to go through and see what are my longest connections that are taking place during the day. So I'm just going through, I'm catting out the conn.log, I'm running it through BroCut, and I'm saying grab the timestamp, the source IP, destination IP, let's take a look at the port that was being used, what's the service, and what was the duration. Now, normally I wouldn't bother with port and service. I did it here just to kind of show you stuff on the slide. I ignore it because it's really, any connection between the system is what matters. The reason I pulled it in here was to be able to kind of refer to what Alex was talking about earlier, which is Zeek's amazing ability to go through and find applications on any port. This is cool Because again, it's not, oh, hey, it was TCP 443, so it must be HTTPS. No, no, no. Zeek goes in and says, okay, there was communication taking place on this port. Does it look like HTTP? No. Does it look like SSH? No. Does it look like SSL? Yes, it does. Okay, good. I'll label it SSL. If it doesn't look like SSL, it goes through its 50 other application decoders, and it's not until it finds no matches at all that you'll see something like this with this little dash. So this is a long connection that ends up being almost a full 24-hour period of time, and we don't recognize the application layer. That's scary, because that means someone's going out over TCP 443, and they're not doing an SSL handshake. There's no SSL client hello, which you would still get even if it's TLS connection, and there's no digital certificate coming down. So it doesn't look like your standard SSL TLS handshake. That means somebody's tunneling. Anytime somebody's tunneling over a well-known port, TCP 80, TCP 25, TCP 443, that's a pretty clear indication it's probably going to be C2 traffic to worry about. But I'm just using brocut to extract out the fields I'm interested in. I was using sort to say, go look at field 5, which is the duration field, and reverse order sort it and just print me out the first 10 entries. So this is the number of seconds each of these connections were being held open for. So, from a long connections on my network, who do I need to worry about first? Yeah, start at the top of the list. Anybody here that's been holding a connection open for 24 hours, that's worth taking a look at. And by the way, these are not always C2. I've seen a ton of environments. I would say almost every one we've gone in to do a threat hunt for, there is someone that's figured out, hey, I want to go to, insert the business inappropriate type of site name here. I want to go to that type of site. I get filtered out or it gets logged. So I'm just going to SSH back to my home system, bounce through a proxy server, and go out that way instead. Those connections you're going to see being held open for like 5 hours or more, those are probably worth going in and investigating as well. So detecting beacons. So long connections, we talked about those. Beacons, we talked about, that's that constant communication that's taking place going outbound. It's hard to do a beacon analysis with Zeek only, without some sort of statistical analysis. So one of the things you could do is you could go in and you could look at, first you need to go in and kind of figure out which sessions do I want to analyze. And then you could run them through like our analytics or something along those nature to go in and kind of look at what's your min, what's your max. Anytime you see a standard deviation that's very small, that's usually a pretty good indication that, yeah, you're looking at beacon type traffic. So you could go through and kind of pop it through that. But all I did here was I went through and I said, okay, go through the conn.log, grab my source and my destination IP. I also grabbed, source destination IP. I then went through and sorted it. So anytime two IPs talk to each other, all of those are going to be lined up next to each other. And then I said unique /C. So only print one instance, count how many instances there were, and now do a reverse sort on it so it's going from highest to lowest. So which system created the most amount of outbound connections to a single IP address on the internet? It was this one right here. Here's who it talked to. And oh yeah, look, it did 108,000 connections. Okay, that's a lot. That's something that's probably worth going in and taking a look at. So that doesn't tell me for certain it's a beacon though. All that tells me is it's communicating with it a lot. I'd need to go in and do some sort of statistical analysis to figure out, are they going off every half a second or something like that? Is there some sort of pattern taking place? You can also go in and do an analysis based on session size. And like I said, this is the one where you can find stuff that you may not find through other means. So again, all I'm doing is just using brocut to be able to go into the conn.log to extract the stuff I care about, namely how much data was sent, how much data was received. And now I could go in, do a statistical analysis on this to see, hey, if I've got, so this is the same one that was doing 108,000 sessions. So if I see that, 107,000 of those sessions all sent the same amount of data and received the same amount of data, yeah, that's a pretty good indication I got a beacon that I'm looking at here. If I've got a couple of instances where that size changed, okay, that tells me that beacon was activated at that time period. That's something I need to go in and pay really close attention to. Now, you can do a lot of this stuff manually, or we have an open source, which means anybody can use it, product called RITA. Active countermeasures, we have a commercial product called AI Hunter. We have 24 different patents on the way we go in and we do C2 analysis. All of those patents have been implemented in RITA, meaning that this free to use open source tool, anything we've patented, if you grab RITA, you can go through and use it, no problem. But where do you grab it? You can just grab it right up off of GitHub. And really what this does is this does a lot of the data sorting and organizing that I've been talking about as we go through this. For example, long connections. Long connections here, it's going through and identify, here's my timing. So source IP, destination IP, here was the port it was talking to. Notice protocol level isn't identified. So somebody was tunneling through TCP 443, that should say SSL. And here's how long the connection was held open for. So with RITA, I can directly import in all of my Zeek logs, and then I can go through and I can identify who are my long connections. I can do the same thing with beacons. What we do with beacons is we do a scoring system. From 0 to 1.0, the closer you get to 1.0, the more likely the traffic is to be beacon-like in nature. So all I have to do is to go through, again, import my logs from Zeek, run it through RITA, and RITA will come back and tell me, yeah, 0.9997. That's pretty close to 1.0. We are almost 100% certain that this connection here from this IP to that IP is a beacon that's taking place. And C2 over DNS. Alex brought this one up earlier. I've seen CNAMEs being used, text records being used, MX records being used. I've been seeing quad A queries being used. So it looks like a normal IPv6 lookup. But then when you start running down the IP addresses that are being looked up, they either haven't been allocated, they're part of private space. It ended up being a C2 channel. My personal favorite from a, oh my God, somebody's evil standpoint was DKIM signatures. They were actually doing, so DKIM, if you're not familiar, allows me to validate the DNS server on the other side. So it allows me to see, hey, is who I'm talking to actually authoritative for that? Is the mail server authoritative to send mail? So it'll go through and you can request the public key in order to check the hash. Well, instead of a public key, it ends up being a command and control channel. Now, RITA will go through and do an analysis for you on that as well. So up at the top here, here's my titles. Here's my domains. Here's how many hosts I'm seeing. Here's how many connections are taking place. Think about this logically for a second. How many domains does it make sense, or excuse me, how many fully qualified domain names does it make sense for a domain to have on the internet? So if you think for the average environment, that's like 10 or less, right? Because I'm going to have a web server, I'll have a mail server, a couple of DNS servers, maybe a customer portal, and so hey, I hit 5 there, right? So 10 or less is average. Then you're going to get into companies that everybody's heard of: Akamai, Amazon, Microsoft. These big companies that offer SaaS services on the internet. It's not uncommon for them to have a couple of hundred fully qualified domain names that you might talk to on a regular basis. And then you hit the point of 1,000. That's the breaking point that I use. Anytime you see more than 1,000 fully qualified domain names within a domain, that's not normal activity. That's a clear indication to me that somebody's going in and doing command and control over DNS. Now, if I look at this top entry here, r-1x.com, 63,000 fully qualified domain names. It makes no sense at all. So again, RITA helps me kind of zoom in very quickly to see where are my command and control channels over DNS. As I go through the output, I can also go in and see what do the fully qualified domain names look like. And as you can see here, yeah, that clearly was not assigned by a person for other people to use, right? Now, so that's one aspect you can go in and look for, which is too many fully qualified domain names associated with the remote domain. Another thing to look for is just, does that domain get accessed? Let me show you what I mean by that. So what we're seeing here is that the akamaiedge.net domain has 154 hosts in it. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's a reasonable amount. It's less than the 1,000 cutoff that I was talking about. So our DNS looked up 154 unique host names. There were 3 DNS servers on the internal network doing those lookups. Okay, I've got 3 resolvers. That makes sense. And now I have 14 systems that actually went out and connected to akamaiedge.com or akamaiedge.net. So I found 154 different systems, and 14 systems went out and visited those systems. That's kind of normal activity. That's how we expect DNS to work. Now, look at this one. So again, that r-1x.com, we said 62,000 fully qualified domain names. Only one host ever visits that network. That doesn't make sense, right? If I'm looking up that many hosts, there better be a bunch of my internal systems that need to access that domain. Clearly, that's not the case. So if I can go through and kind of parse the data out this way, this also helps me identify when DNS is being used as a command and control channel. So what do you do next? Okay, so let's say we've gone through, we've identified, yeah, we've got a persistent connection that's taking place. What do you do next? Well, now we get into protocol analysis. You know, is it TCP 443, but it's not identified as SSL? That's a red flag. Is it going over, you know, as Alex was talking about, is it going over TCP port 80, but it's not being identified as HTTP? Again, that's a red flag. Look at the reputation of the external system. In other words, look at it, who manages it? Is that a business partner? Is it a SaaS service you bought into? Is it a field office? If it's none of those things, if there's no easy business need you can tie it to, that makes it really suspicious. You can go through threat intel feeds. Maybe they've gone through and flagged that, in which case it becomes even more suspicious. Look at that internal system and see if you can't figure something out. We had an early beta customer come in that took installed our software on the wire, started monitoring what was going on in their network. They got back to us within about 3 days and said, hey, we think we're seeing a couple of beacons, but we're not certain. Can you look at the data with us? And one of the things we identified was there was 3 internal IP addresses that were all connecting to Guangzhou, China, and they had no field office or business partner or anything in Guangzhou, China. We further figured out those 3 systems were all IP-based cameras, and they were the only IP-based cameras that were on the network, and there were 3 IP-based cameras that were bought at the same time by the facilities team off of Amazon. You know where this is going, right? They were compromised directly from the manufacturer. So that commonality between those 3 systems, hey, I see these 3 things acting the same way, and oh, hey, look, they're all the same platform. Sometimes that's a really good clue. What I like to do is kind of score these things. So anytime I find a persistent connection, that's a threat score of like 70 or 80 that I assign to a system. And now if it's a unique user agent, maybe that's another 5 points. If it's, you know, tunneling things out, that's another 10, 15 points on top of that. And what I kind of look at this from the perspective of is if I can come up with a score of 0, I know for sure it's safe. If I come up with a score of 100, I know for sure it's compromised. We need to go into forensics and incident handling mode. That kind of helps me define, you know, hey, if I'm at a 60, I really need to collect more data. Maybe I need to go back to my SIEM and see if I can't get host level logs. I need to dig into this a little bit deeper. Anytime you go through this, like I said, and it turns out, nope, this is a business need, whitelist it so you don't go back through it again later. And that'd be it for my spiel.
Thank you, Chris. We've got a few more minutes left, so we've got time for a bit of Q&A here. Again, you're able to ask questions via the questions panel on your GoToWebinar. We've got a number of questions here and about 5 minutes left before we hit the hour, so let's see what we can get to here.
Yeah, bring the questions.
Yeah. Can the slides be made available as a PDF after the presentation? Yeah, I see no reason why not. We can distribute the slides as a PDF in addition to the recording that'll be made. Another question here, can you guys talk a little bit more about how to detect C2s over encrypted connections? Are there any other strategies or techniques you would recommend?
You want to start with that, Alex, or you want me to?
Yeah, so I'll start with that. So that's actually one of the things that the Corelight research team is taking a look at these days specifically is what we can determine about the content of an encrypted channel without doing any kind of break and inspect. And, you know, a lot of the same session and size timing that Chris has spoken to is very applicable to encrypted channels. But there's also everything from, you know, is this TLS 1.0 because an attacker hasn't kept their toolkit current? Is the JA3 hash on this just different from the rest of my network? And so I can single it out for further inspection. Are there any clues in the certificate, etc.? There's a lot of metadata that comes along with encrypted channels that comes across in clear text that you can take a look at to really build a picture of what is going on, particularly when combined with layer 4 analytics in terms of IP or AS reputation or any of the other sorts of where is this going kind of metadata on the internet.
Yeah, we found the same thing, Alex. Actually, so I want to make a distinction, which is when you talk about like C2 traffic, it falls into one of two categories. It was created by the bad guys or it was created by a red team. And they have different motivations. You know, for the bad guy, it's a business model. So this is one portion of everything else that they need to solve in order to try and monetize it. You know, they need to figure out how to fish you properly and all that other stuff. And what we found is their C2 tends to be somewhat simplistic today because we're really not good at actually catching it. Most C2, once it gets established on a network, runs for more than 6 months before it actually gets caught. Red teamers, however, they get paid to break in. They get paid to go undetected. So what we found is that as far as like encrypting the payload goes, that same timing and size analysis that I'm talking about, it works whether the data is encrypted or not. The one time we've run into where the size analysis, they were actually varying the size as they went and they were encrypting it, it was a red team that was getting paid to break into the network.
Right, and that's a very apt observation because, you know, one of the things that I always saw in my years of malware analysis is that the bad guys really only want to do as much as is strictly necessary for them to make their money. And so where they can be, they're often lazy. And so some of those things that you would think would be obvious and people would go to great lengths to disguise, they don't.
Well, I think it's also, again, you need to kind of look at it as a business model. So like if right now I don't have a good phishing scheme to get your users to click things, that's the problem I need to solve. You know, if my C2 is simplistic, who cares? If I can't get in, that doesn't matter. If I don't have a way to monetize it, if I haven't figured out a way, once I get you to click it, how do I make cash from that? That's a problem I have to solve. So again, if I'm using simplistic C2, who cares? So right. I don't think it's so much lazy as it is, you know, anytime you have a business, there's problems that need to be solved. You need to prioritize things. C2 is always at the bottom of the list because, again, it usually takes people 6 months to snag it. I mean, if you look at like Starwood like scares me because Starwood had got their PCI, you know, they were compromised for over 4 years. And while they were compromised, they received their PCI attestation multiple times. I think they had their SOC 2. They went through due diligence when Hilton went in and bought them. So all these investigations were taking place and the C2 got missed. So why create some, you know, why make your code more complex to hide your encrypted channel if nobody's going to find it anyway? I mean, I think that's a lot of what we deal with. Red teamers, like I said, they get paid to get missed. So they're more likely to try and encrypt things and vary the payload and the timing and everything else all at the same time. And they're not really worried about monetizing it beyond, did I get in, yes or no? You know, I could easily write a beacon that only beacons once every 5 days that no one's ever going to catch. As a C2, it's useless. But if I'm a red teamer and I'm getting paid simply to have access to your network, that being able to send a command once every 5 days is plenty for what my needs are.
Gentlemen, we are almost at time here, and thank you again so much for your time today presenting. There was a number of questions that I'm going to try to summarize about how to operationalize the tools that they've seen here today. Questions about Corelight, active countermeasures, RITA, and Zeek. So just to kind of quick clarify, and then if you guys have any last comments before we close out. As Chris mentioned, active countermeasures is a commercial project, and they also create RITA, which is an open source version of some of those same tools and analysis approaches. Corelight is a commercialization of Zeek. So we make a set of Zeek-based software sensors that make it really easy to use Zeek at scale and get it deployed quickly and integrated in your environment. And so we have a number of questions, gentlemen, just about how to get up and running and how Corelight and RITA and active countermeasures can work together. Do you have any last thoughts on that before we close out?
Yeah, just real quick. So we do more than commercial. We have ADHD, which is an awesome toolkit, Passer, which is kind of the new version of like P0F. So there's a bunch of open source tools that we go through and run. As far as like how these pieces integrate together, once Zeek goes through and writes its logs, you can tell RITA, hey, go grab those logs, and it'll go through and create the screens that I was going through and showing. As we come out of this, if anybody has any questions, hey, my email address is on the screen. I already admitted I am an OCD geek that loves security. I am more than happy to talk shop with anybody. So feel free to just drop me a note.
Great, thanks. Alex, any last closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say that I have a commercial Corelight sensor feeding an AI Hunter instance in the cloud out of my home lab, and it's something that I was able to set up in about 10 minutes several weeks ago and have forgotten it ever since. But it is still chugging away, creating all this rich data. It's really a turnkey kind of a solution at that level. If you've got more time than money, open source is your jam, go do your thing. But if you just need to get something up and running, it's probably worth dropping us a line on the commercial side.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Again, this webcast will be recorded, so you can share this with your colleagues if you'd like. And the slides will be made available. And for those of you whose questions we weren't able to answer, I apologize. We've got them logged, and your email address will follow up via email afterwards. Thanks so much, and we'll call that a wrap.
Thanks, folks. Had a ball.